I'm George غالاوي, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George غالاوي, here in London for Mayadeen television, with an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. Tonight's show requires you to imagine two things. First of all, that by the time this show is broadcast, Donald Trump is still the President of the United States. And more importantly, it requires you to imagine that the world will still exist, because the world's most dangerous man is in possession of nuclear weapons, and he says he's locked and loaded and ready to use them. The world's most dangerous man, of course, is not Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, but Donald J. Trump, the leader of the United States of America. The North Korean state may or may not have a viable nuclear weapon that can leave the atmosphere and re-enter it and deliver its payload. Donald J. Trump has many thousands of them. In fact, on this day of recording, he tweeted that he's in Camp David, surrounded by what he described as his very talented generals. Now, I don't know if they're the equivalent of the men in white coats taking him away to a lunatic asylum. Whether the generals have taken him effectively prisoner, we'll explore some of that in the course of the next hour and a half or so, or whether he's there in Camp David with his generals planning the aforementioned nuclear assault. In which case, the world will not exist, because, of course, North Korea has as its neighbors both the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, and they will simply not tolerate a nuclear attack or perhaps any military attack on their neighbor, fearing, as well they might, that this is a precursor to an attack upon them. Particularly China. There is no doubt that Donald Trump carries a tremendous animus towards China on behalf of a United States that has seen itself overtaken economically and in many other respects by China over the last few years, quite a few years short of when that was expected to happen. China is now the world's largest economy, holds more dollars than the US Treasury, and is in possession of truly vast amounts of American debt. China is also doing very well in cultivating friends all over the world, almost as fast as the United States is losing them. The Chinese presence in Africa, in Latin America, and in the rest of Asia is a matter of record and a matter of concern for a United States which only a few years ago imagined itself in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union as being hegemonic in the world forever. Indeed, one of their pet theorists, Professor Fukuyama, was very clear about it. It was, he said, the end of history. He meant the triumph for all time of the American model of what they call democracy and what they call free market capitalism. There's no doubt that Trump, in his election campaign, made much of China's progress. He called it quite a pithy phrase, actually. I don't know, Charlie, if you were responsible for it. He said, China has eaten your lunch. And that, to some extent, of course, is true. As the United States has deindustrialized, China has massively industrialized, and China is producing goods and material at a price which the United States capitalists could not possibly match and had no intention of matching, and instead sought to export jobs to cheaper labor forces elsewhere. And that was one of the reasons why Donald Trump won. Now, the big question is Is North Korea, number one, entitled to arm itself to the best of its ability? And number two, is it wise to do so? Well, I have a record on this matter. I was one of the very few members of Parliament who was arrested on the ground outside Britain's nuclear weapons base at Faslane. In fact, I gave the only ever interview given to the BBC by a man being carried by 4 police officers whilst upside down. And I was thrown into Greenock jail for my pains. So I'm against nuclear weapons, but I never did understand how it could be maintained that some people were allowed to have nuclear weapons, indeed thousands of them, whilst other people's were not. If, after all, the thesis is that it is possession of nuclear weapons that guarantees peace, well, if that's true, why doesn't everyone have nuclear weapons? In which case, mutually assured destruction, as they used to call it, or MAD for short, would be tested to its limit. But the idea that the United States and Israel, just to pick 2 from a rather short list, are entitled to nuclear weapons, but the people that they're pointing them at don't have the right to seek nuclear weapons to defend themselves, seems to me inherently, well, mad. And is North Korea justified in fearing that somebody might attack it? Well, for younger viewers, let me tell you that in my lifetime, the United States and Britain and its allies killed 3 million Koreans in an invasion, in a full-scale war, a precursor to the Vietnam War, took place on the Korean peninsula in my lifetime. And 3 million Koreans were killed. The country was reduced to rubble and ash. This was because of the temerity of some Koreans to wish to unify their country as one country. Again, almost a replica of the struggle in Vietnam just a few years later. Korea was divided, and it has been ever since. And the armed camp that is South Korea is complemented, you might say, added to, by a plethora of American military bases, nuclear armed, in the region. And all their weapons are pointed at Korea, China, and Russia. So is North Korea entitled to have weapons? I say yes. If everybody else has got them, why not them? And is Korea justified in fearing that other people will wish to attack it? Again, almost that question doesn't need an answer, because every single year and roundabout now, there are military maneuvers, so-called war games, conducted by the US military and their South Korean ally in Korea and off the waters of Korea every year. So you don't have to be paranoid to think they're all out to get you. They may all be out to get you. And in the case of North Korea, they are all out to get them. Now, there may be some in the audience who are admirers of the North Korean system. I'm not one of them. There may be some in the audience think that in the battle of the haircuts, Kim Jong-un is much to be preferred to Donald Trump. I would not be one of those either. At least the word much would lose me. I'm not here to support the political system in North Korea, but I am here to say the United States has no business choosing the leadership in Korea or anywhere else. That is a matter entirely for the Korean people. And that's a principled stand that I have taken through many recent trials and tribulations, as most of you know. So let me throw it to the distinguished audience and the enthusiastic amateurs to hear what they think. What will become of Donald Trump's policy towards Korea and China? Madam, You have the microphone. Go ahead.
Thank you, George. Largely what you've said has been taken right out of my mouth. I can hardly add to it, except that I would describe myself as an editor of Proletarian magazine, as a supporter of North Korea and its government and its people. So the only thing that I would add is one needs to understand why all this enmity towards a tiny little country that is in no position to cause any harm to anybody, because they would be obliterated if they even thought about it. And really they've had plenty of opportunities to obliterate if that's what they wanted to do. They certainly do not want to do that. They just want to live in peace. But the reason for all this hatred of this tiny little country is because of their economic system. This doesn't tend to be mentioned very much. They talk about the political system, but the economic system. This is a country that for 70 years, since the end of the Second World War, has been constantly attacked because its economic system is one of socialist economic planning. And because of that, in spite of all the sanctions against it, in spite of all the devastation caused to it, both in the Second World War and in the Korean War, 50 to 53, it has been able to perform miracles in terms of its economic development. It has been able to create these bombs. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, should it have a nuclear bomb? But what's totally amazing is that this little country, under sanctions, has actually been able to build these bombs. And the reason it does that is that its economic planning system means that there's not a moment of labor of all these people that live there that's wasted. Everybody works. There's no unemployment. And more than that, there's no undereducation. Everybody is educated to the maximum of their ability, and this is why they're actually able to perform the miracles that they do. And this is what America, Britain, and all the other people that attacked Korea in the Korean War, this is why they can't allow it to progress. They have to stamp on it, and yet they can't.
Well, I think there's only one place to go after the editor of the Proletarian magazine, and that's to the People's Friend from the United States, from the Republicans abroad, Charlie Wolf. Charlie, what do you say to that and to the big question?
I don't know which North Korea you're describing. It doesn't sound like the one I'm familiar with, where there's a lack of liberty, an extreme lack of liberty, and Kim Jong-un is there because his father and his grandfather before him were the ruling family. There's no political.
Although that can happen in the United States too.
Well, no, there's still votes. I mean, yes, you can have a father and son. We've had, I think, two or three combinations of relations occupying the White House, but they've all been elected. I see in North Korea a very fascist, totalitarian country where you do as you're told, or you end up probably dead if you don't mourn correctly, or you don't clap for the president on his birthday, or compliment his hair in a wild hairstyle it is.
I wouldn't, if I were an American Republican, talk about a leader's hair.
Well, but at least I can criticize my leader's hair. I wouldn't want to do it in North Korea. Also, I remember all the times that we've been supplying wheat, and of course the Chinese have been trading with the North Koreans and supplying most of their economy for them. So I'm not quite sure what the countries. The thing that I find kind of strange is I was on the BBC last Sunday with probably a friend of yours, Bruce Kent, a friend of mine as well. And I have some respect for Bruce from CND, and he was saying the same sort of line you were using.
CND is the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Yes. And he used that same line of, well, if America has them, why can't North Korea? And I kind of thought, well, wait a minute. Why are you trying to increase the supply of nuclear weapons when I thought you wanted to have less? The difference is one is a responsible country. We're a responsible democracy, as is this country here. There are constitutions and laws in place. Donald Trump or Theresa May or Her Majesty the Queen don't have a button. They're not going to just launch a button and start a war. With Kim Jong-un, you just don't know. We would like to get rid of nuclear weapons, but again, as long as there are bad actors in the world that have them, you need to keep these as a form of defense. And it does work. It is a deterrent. It's the reason we're still here today. So, I don't want to see North Korea with the nuclear arms. I don't want to see them giving them to the Iranians. I don't want to see them peddling them to other bad actors around the world. And yes, Donald Trump is standing up to the man, and I think that's what's working. And yes, we will act.
Can I just press you on that point? In what sense is it working?
Well, I think that Kim Jong-un is going to come to his senses, or the Chinese are going to talk to him and say, this is not worth what you're doing, because we don't want to go to war. We have no reason to go to war. But if he develops these nuclear weapons, or he threatens, as he's been out and out doing, I mean, this is the only guy that's been making threats, then we're going to have to respond.
Wasn't he responding to threats rather than making them?
No, I don't think so. I think he's been stoking this up.
Isn't there existentially a threat against North Korea from the United States?
Like I said, we've the ones been supplying with wheat in the past. When they've had their threats of unsealing their nuclear reactors and what have you. He's broken treaty after treaty. So I can think of better things to do than to go into North Korea at present. But we will stand up for our security and security of others.
Isn't there a lack of, I almost laugh in saying this, a lack of consistency in Trump's approach? At one stage he said that he would be happy, I can't remember whether it was a hot dog or a Coca-Cola, but he or maybe both. Was it both?
It was a hamburger.
A hamburger, that he'd have a hamburger with Kim Jong-un. In fact, just a day or so ago, he seemed to praise the Korean leader. So you could be forgiven for not quite knowing what Trump's going to do next, or maybe that's axiomatic in the case of
I hope it wasn't the same hamburger, because we just obviously had the anniversary of Elvis's death. I hope it wasn't the same cheeseburger, bacon cheeseburger.
That killed Elvis.
Yes. Wow. No, again, there are several approaches. We don't hate these people. There's no reason to. He would rather be talking, as with Putin. He says, I respect Putin's power. He doesn't respect necessarily Putin in what he does as a quasi-dictator, I guess, if I can use the term widely, in Russia. But he respects the power and will sit down with the man and will gladly speak with him. The same as he did with Xi Jinping. And I think Xi Jinping is understanding what's going on here and maybe has reached him on some level. Not totally, but I think he's broken the ice. So, I'd rather jaw than war. And Tillerson, Secretary Tillerson has said, yes, we'd like you to be part of the community of nations. We'd like you to be a responsible country. We'll help you economically. But if you are going to threaten either ourselves or a protectorate like Guam, then there will be a consequence for your actions. And, in Trump's words, it will be, what was it, fire and, not brimstone, but hell and fury, or whatever the
Fire
line.
and fury.
Fire and fury.
Locked and loaded.
Locked and loaded.
I'm in Camp David with my generals.
Yeah.
Which part of these things should we not be afraid of?
Well, you don't have to be afraid of any of them. He is talking a consequence. If they do an action, there will be a consequence. And that's how it really should be in the world. If you do an action, there is consequences for actions. If you decide to attack or make threats, then there will be a consequence for your action. Simple as that. It's not going to be a nuclear holocaust. I don't think he's talking about nuclear weapons. You don't have to even go that far for fire and fury. It'll be conventional. But he wants them to understand that the United States can only be so patient when it comes to threats of nuclear weapons.
Well, there you have it. Parallel universe between two distinct positions. We'll see what the rest of the audience think of that in a minute. For me, and again for younger viewers, I commend Peter Sellers' magnificent film, Dr. Strangelove, How I Grew to Love the Bomb. I have this image of President Trump wearing a cowboy hat, sat astride a nuclear weapon as it descends upon Pyongyang, shouting, "Yee-haw!" But maybe that's just me. Well, we don't have to, if you'll forgive the phrase, fire all our bullets in the first part of the show. We are not just talking either about North Korea. We're talking about China, which is, of course, to use a phrase that Donald Trump might himself use, the big enchilada. Because China is a threat to the United States' domination of the world. The world's biggest economy, with the world's biggest army, the world's greatest population, most industrious people on the earth, and they too are regarded by the United States leadership as a threat. That's why there are US nuclear bombers flying over the South China Sea, the clue being in the name. There are no Chinese nuclear bombers flying over the Gulf of Florida, and if there were, we'd probably already be in the aforementioned World War. The United States has a nuclear-armed navy steaming in the aforementioned South China Sea, again the clue being in the name. The United States has openly allied with Japan, its satrapy, in the various conflicts which exist over territorial waters and land between China and Japan. So it could be, or at least China could be forgiven for suspecting it might be, that just as the mother of all bombs that was dropped on a mountain in Afghanistan to kill 14 jihadis at the cost of $201 million was really intended to send a message to Pyongyang, China may well be justified in believing that the stance towards North Korea is in fact a precursor, a harbinger of big storms to come between the United States and China. All of that is up for grabs in this edition of كلمة for Al-Mayadeen Television. We'll be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, here in London. But talking Donald Trump, talking China, and talking North Korea and the crisis that exists on the Korean Peninsula in the light of President Trump's declaration that he was locked and loaded. That could, of course, have a different connotation, a different meaning. Loaded with what? Let's take another of our experts. Yes, sir, please introduce yourself and say your piece.
I'm Stephen Chan. I'm the Professor of World Politics at SOAS, University of London.
Welcome.
I think precisely because the Chinese are engineering an economic miracle that is now globally massive, challenging if not already in excess of American productivity, the last thing they want is a war on their frontiers. So the Chinese are very, very actively talking behind the scenes to the North Korean leadership as moderating forces. Just as in the United States, I think the generals, General Mattis, for instance, the Secretary of Defense.
That's Mad Dog Mattis, as he's known.
Very one, the reader of Marcus Aurelius himself.
I just wonder if how safe we should be that we are counting on someone called Mad Dog Mattis to restrain President Trump.
Because what you have are gradations, perhaps, of madness. As a reader of the great Roman philosopher Marcus Aurelius, he knows the limits of war, and that the United States, like China, at this stage of its economic recovery or development, can't afford to go to this kind of war. And I think those are restraining factors. And I think that what would be a particular restraint on General Mattis is a simple geographical fact. Between the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea to Seoul is only 35 miles of flat land. That can't be defended in depth. Any military general would recognize that. The minute the counter-invasion rolls forth across the demilitarized zone, millions of South Koreans will die, not necessarily as a result of the invasion, but of a counterstrike by the United States. In other words, you would sacrifice up to 3 to 10 million South Korean citizens to defend against a northern attack. So for that reason, I don't think an attack is imminent, and that restraint is going to be very much the rule of the day right now. I think the Americans are taking a lot of time, however, in working out the exact nature of the North Korean regime. It's not a paradise, and in fact is only just now emerging from a number of decades of being very much behind the times in terms of technological development. Its economy was based very much on a mechanical engineering model. It's only now in the last 10 years has developed technological capacity of an electronic or modern caliber. so that its skill now in international hacking of computer networks rivals that of both China and Russia. And some of that has been applied to its nuclear weapons program. Although even here, I would add a note of caution and restraint. Its ability to develop proto-nuclear weapons is almost certainly from leakage from Pakistani sources. Its delivery vehicles are almost certainly leakage from Ukrainian sources. They didn't do this by themselves. Now, precisely because of the source of their weaponry, what you've got are antiquated systems, both of explosive and also of delivery vehicle. So what you have is, in fact, the possibility of a threat that is very, very much not ready to be used at any point in time. Precisely because it's not ready to be used at any point in time, it is very much in the interests both of the Chinese and of the Americans to continue diplomacy. In all of this, the loud rhetoric and the very, very careless use of colorful words by President Trump, that, I think, is the real danger to world peace.
Well, Professor, your sage words are most welcome. And I know little of the works of Marcus Aurelius, but I did see Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry. And I saw him with a Colt Magnum pointed at the head of a gangster on the ground who was thinking about going for his gun. And Clint Eastwood said, "I know what you're thinking, punk. Did I fire 6 shots or only 5? And you've got to ask yourself, do you feel lucky?" Now, you say that North Korea probably doesn't have the nuclear weapons potential that the world has been led to believe that it has, not least by vainglorious boasting by the North Koreans themselves, though you could understand why they might do that. If you were coming through my window, God forbid, I might claim that I had a shotgun trained on you. The question is, do we feel lucky? Because I have been to North Korea, not once, but twice. And much of what you say I agree with, not least their habit of claiming that they have done things themselves that in fact other people did. I recall very well the beautiful underground railway system in Pyongyang, which they very proudly showed me, but they never once mentioned that China actually built it. And when I went to China and said I was very impressed by the North Korean underground, they said we built that underground for them before we built our own underground. So there is an element of that. The question is, do we feel lucky? Now, of all the American leaders in my lifetime, and I don't exclude George W. Bush, the one who makes me most nervous about the fact he just might do something that will test how lucky we actually are. And you're right, even if, let's assume, North Korea has no nuclear weapons capability meaningfully, what they do have is a very gigantic and highly motivated army. And that army would promptly be in Seoul. 35 miles of flat land wouldn't take them an afternoon because it cannot be defended in depth. And then the United States would fire nuclear weapons. And then both China and Russia would be in a nuclear war because a slight shift of the wind would kill not just millions of Koreans, but kill millions of Chinese and even Russian people. So whilst I'm grateful for the balm that you've sought to pour on this question, it does really require you to feel lucky, doesn't it?
It absolutely requires us all to feel lucky. But what you are talking about is a doomsday scenario, and you can't factor that out. It's perfectly possible with the current leadership in the United States that volatility might triumph, and we do enter that kind of doomsday scenario with all kinds of roll-on effects, and we find ourselves in a worldwide nuclear catastrophe. Having said that, what I think is really beginning to happen behind the scenes is in the simulation of possible conflict and all the games theory strategies and scenarios that both sides are mapping out, it's actually the North Koreans that have got the American number in terms of very rationally calling the bluff, pushing them to the edge, not giving an inch, letting other people diffuse, as it were, the situation, such as the Chinese, climbing down at just the right moment, just withdrawing the threat to bomb Guam, for instance. In terms of a diplomatic masterclass, it's actually the North Koreans who are playing the diplomatic masterclass. And I think this is beginning to seep into the consciousness of a number of American statesmen and policymakers. They're not dealing with a madman. He might be a bad man, but that doesn't make him a madman. So if we can avoid the mistake we've made constantly in the past of thinking that bad people are also mad and ascribe to them the rationality that they try to propose in international relations, that might, in the final analysis, save us from your doomsday scenario.
Now, let me ask you, because we have people with very different perspectives here, but as an eminent professor, let me ask you how you characterize the North Korean regime. We've heard it described as fascist. Alternatively, we've heard it described as socialist. What's your characterization of it?
Well, none of those, because we're trying to ascribe labels that come out of a Western or a European political philosophical history. They have, as it were, elements of socialism and communism, and I dare say perhaps Stalinism in their makeup. But what you also have there is a very authentic, autochthonous North Koreanism, something which draws from their own culture, something which we've not researched and therefore we find very difficult to understand, but a very, very great culture of very great pride and insularity. So they weren't known as the hermit kingdom for nothing. They always were an isolated people, always did set about trying to do their own thing, and fiercely proud with all kinds of national emblems of great power and strength, and of medicinal and spiritual strength and depth. Trying to understand all of this only in the context of Western labels is not going to come to the heart of the problem. That's why the Chinese are so important, because as an Eastern neighbor, they can understand a lot of this. But you have to bear in mind that the Chinese, too, have got great problems in trying to understand North Korea. The two countries have had a long and a very difficult history that goes back through antiquity. They're not close friends, historically speaking. So what you've got are two sides, both the Chinese and the Americans, trying to conduct diplomacy. The great tragedy here is that nobody on the American side knows how to sink in with the Chinese side of how to negotiate in cultural terms as well as political terms that the North Koreans understand.
Now, China did enter the Korean War when the West, or more properly the United Nations, though the Soviet Union had withdrawn from the Security Council at the time and could not veto, as they surely would have done, the United Nations mandate to invade Korea. But China entered the war and paid a very heavy price for so doing in order to assist, if not to assist the North Korean leadership, certainly to repel the invader. What would China's attitude be if my doomsday scenario came to pass?
If your doomsday scenario came to pass, then it certainly would be a doomsday scenario, even though entered very, very reluctantly. Every time I'm in Beijing and I talk to the Chinese, and I work at State Council level, and I mention the word North Korea, the immediate response every single time is exactly along the lines that you just put forward. We gave so much blood to defend Korea, the north of Korea, in the 1950s against the Western forces. We can't repudiate the suffering and the sacrifice of our country people at that point in time. If it comes to blood again, it will come to blood again, and the Chinese will side with the North Koreans.
I do hope that that message is heard in the United States. Charlie, do you want to respond? In the interest of balance, we should...
No, I appreciate many of the response Professor Chen made, I think, very sagacious and very erudite, and I can agree with a lot of your analysis. And besides, obviously, the border to the south going into South Korea, let's not forget the border to the north, which is going into China, which is another reason why the Chinese are probably very, I don't know if I'd say nervous, but there's a little bit of trepidation. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why it's one of the few times that being a little bit unstable works. We've had very stable presidents that we understand. Even Bush. I was going to say even Nixon. Nixon, of course, opened the door to China. So he was probably one of the best presidents in foreign affairs.
Come back, Richard Nixon. I never thought I'd heard myself say so.
Watergate was obviously a big mess, but as a president on international affairs and what have you, he was actually very highly rated. But that's an aside. And this is one of the few times where having someone like Donald Trump that you may not be fully able to read actually works to an advantage, because people are going to say, will he or won't he? Because maybe he's just nuts enough. You were talking about this reading of being mad as opposed to bad. Well, I don't think he's bad, but maybe let people have the perception he's a little bit mad. And that's what makes it work.
It's a very unstable
he's really not. But
we're asked to be reassured by the presence of Mad Dog Mattis, and doubly reassured by the fact that Donald Trump might be mad.
Mad Dog is actually probably the least mad amongst them. He's got the term because he was so highly respected by his troops as a Marine. This is the sort of Marine general that was at the front leading his men in. And again, he would know Marcus Aurelius, and he's probably more well-read than everybody here in the room combined.
Well, the eminent professor accepted.
Well, it would be an interesting conversation between the two, I'm sure, if you're getting into Marcus Aurelius. I think what's important also is he's putting out a message, a wider message, again, to the Chinese, and getting them involved. And I think to bad actors around the world. We've had 8 years of President Obama, and I have to credit him trying. But the apology tour, as it was called, I think had a deleterious effect. We need people to understand that we are the world's leader, and we're going to stand for certain things. And amongst that is the Reagan peace through strength. This is essentially peace through strength.
I've got news for you, Charlie. You ain't my leader.
Well,
you've never been my leader.
No, I don't mean your personal leader.
With Donald Trump, no, not even personal.
But we have a responsibility.
I don't think you have grasped fully how utterly bankrupt American power is in the world. America is a laughingstock in the world.
No,
they look at Charlottesville, they look at Donald J. Trump, and the idea that you're their leader is preposterous.
Listen, amongst the commentariat, sure, you're going to have that sort of a feeling. But I think when you're talking about the world's leaders, when they're looking to who's going to be that last resort, that, peace through strength, this is what falls on the United States.
We've had this rumpus before, so,
I know.
Let's not repeat it.
It's always nice to wind you up.
I reject the idea that you are in any way exceptional. Yeah. I reject the idea that you have any manifest destiny. I reject the idea that you're our leader, still less our father. And moreover, the rest of the world's caught up with me. Nobody with any sense in the world regards the United States as their leader.
Well, when I say leader, I mean, again, I don't mean your personal leader. Obviously, countries are sovereign states, and this is something we believe in deeply.
Obviously.
No, of course we do. You don't see
Anyway, Charles, you're a good sport, and I'm grateful to you for being so again. I want to call, if I may, my old friend, Keith Bennett, but it will be in the next segment when we will hear from the public on the streets of London, something I forgot to do at the beginning of this segment. This is كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen in London. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing Donald Trump and his policy towards China and North Korea. We took the كلمة camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Take a look at this.
Who do you think will benefit from the tension between North Korea and the US?
Who would benefit from it? America.
America, yeah?
Yeah.
Do you think
Western powers will benefit from it.
I don't think anybody benefits. I think the world it's not a good thing for anybody.
Neither, I think, because of the tensions are so high that I don't think any side can come out of this on top.
Whoever is manufacturing arms, you know, I mean, everybody else is going to suffer. Will anybody be benefit from it? Yeah, massively. There'll be loads of money made from it. You know, loads of like all sorts created as a result of just that like dialogue. Well, I'm sitting here having a conversation with you now about it.
I think it's just indicative of everything that Trump's been doing. It's going to be North Korea, it's going to be somebody else, it's going to be somebody else. And all it does is it just brings the rest of the world into it. So nobody out of either them or the rest of the world is going to actually benefit at all.
I'm told that there's like trillions worth of dollars of minerals in North Korea that's been untapped. They don't get along with Western civilization. They want to get in there just like everywhere else.
What do you think about the tension between North Korea and the US?
I'm scared. I'm really scared. In fact, my girl's building a bunker right now in her back garden. I'm serious. This is not funny.
Do you think a war will kick off?
Well, it will if they continue. They have to do something, won't they?
Well, quite a healthy dose of cynicism there, Charles, amongst your former empire people. The idea that the United States is doing all this for any kind of noble purpose seemed thin on the ground there, Keith Bennett. What did you think of the voices of the people, and what do you think of the debate so far?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about the Vox Pops we just saw was how relatively well informed people were. If you compare it to something that's gone out on YouTube over the last week or so, where the similar Vox Pop was done in the United States, and people were first asked should they consider taking military action against North Korea, and most of the American respondents said yes, they should. They were then showed a map of the world, and they were asked to show where North Korea was.
This can't end well.
One of them could find it. Some of them appear to think it was somewhere in the north of Canada. The main place people thought it was the Middle East, interestingly enough, because, of course, the United States has a recent form in that part of the world. Other people thought it was up in the Arctic, and some got it more or less near, but nobody actually got it right. So this is the kind of quality of global leadership that I find it a little bit hard to relate to. I think we've had an interesting discussion today where we're told that the DPRK, North Korea as it's known, is not a responsible nation. The United States is a responsible nation. Or when that point of view was amplified, we were told that presumably as the reason why the United States is a responsible nation is that its president
might be mad.
Be mad, yes. It was appearance we come to now because Trump was contrasted unfavourably, and all things being relative correctly, in my opinion, with Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon can be remembered not just for the opening to China, it can be remembered not just for Watergate, but as I'm sure you remember, George, he can be remembered for the Christmas 1972 bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong, where Nixon and Kissinger sat together and said that this was the madman theory, that they would unleash bombing of North Vietnam that was so savage that people would think they were actually mad. Now, Nixon and Kissinger may be many things. I don't think they were mad. The trouble is that George Bush may well be. And in terms of which...
Donald Trump.
Yes.
Don't get your madmen mixed up. You said George Bush.
Ah, okay. Showing my age. But I did mean Donald Trump. I think this question has to be teased out a little further as to which nation is responsible and which is not. The United States is the only country in the world that has used atomic weapons in warfare, incinerating 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's interesting that when Donald Trump referred to the fire and fury of the type the world has never seen before, the only time an American president has ever used that type of language before was actually immediately before the atomic bombing of those Japanese cities. Trump made that statement on the 72nd anniversary of the incineration of Nagasaki. The United States has waged wars constantly throughout the world. It's fighting perhaps now in 7 or 8 nations. North Korea, whatever judgment people wish to make about its internal system, is not a country that has attacked any other. It has repeatedly said that it's the nuclear weapons that it's developing are for self-defense. So if one's looking for which is the responsible nation in this situation, as the professor here to my right talked about the North Korean diplomatic skills, the responsible nation in this scenario, I think, is not the United States. I think the other countries that one has to look at, just Russia and China are coordinating their approach on the Korean Peninsula, as indeed they are increasingly in other areas of international affairs, very, very closely. But although Trump's tweets moved off of Korea for a bit this week, he was rather taken up with Charlottesville, but it has been quite a frenetic week of international diplomacy around the Korean Peninsula. And one of the things that's happened is not widely reported in the Western media, but the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, had a telephone conversation this week in which the Chinese Foreign Minister made the statement that no country will be allowed to stir up trouble on the borders of China and Russia. I think this is a very significant statement.
Indeed. Charlie, can I ask you about the changes in the White House? I mean, it's hard to believe that Trump's only been there. He's only been president for 7 months. It feels a lot longer than that. There's a tremendous turmoil, it would appear, inside the White House. I have forgotten now how many of, when we look at those first pictures, they've almost all gone and have to be airbrushed out. The latest is the ideologue, Steve Bannon. Now, paradoxically, although he is painted in the West as the most extreme right-winger, which he may be, he's also the most extreme non-interventionist of the circle surrounding Trump. Is his sacking, therefore, a good thing or a bad thing from the point of view of the world being anxious about war and turmoil?
Well, I think for him it's a good thing because he's, in a sense, like yourself. I mean, you were a great voice in Parliament. You're a fantastic orator. I've enjoyed watching your interventions in the House over the years. But obviously, I think you're in a stronger position now. Obviously, when you were a member of the Labour Party, your hands were tied. Then you freed yourself of the shackles of that. But I think Steve Bannon is in a very good position now to continue the agenda, and that is the president's agenda, which, of course, was looking towards cleaning the swamp. It's geared to the working man on the street. It's trying to bring down taxes, tax reform, make it less complicated, bring back the jobs, strengthen the economy, and he will be in a better position now to fight Congress, who've been holding up on some of these initiatives, tax reform, the repeal of Obamacare, etc. So I think he's in a far better position than he was. But yes, I mean,
because the proximate cause of the sacking or resignation, depending on your point of view, of Bannon, was said to be, by authoritative sources, that Bannon had contradicted President Trump over North Korea.
Yeah, and again, this was supposedly in this American Prospect article. He claims he was off the record, so I don't know, what the conversation, the nuance of the conversation was, but I think one of the things that may have riled the president was he was taking credit for some things, and any boss I've worked for, I'm sure you've worked for as well, you don't like to, outshine the boss, especially when the boss is the most powerful man in the country or the world. So that probably didn't help. But again, there has been some internecine battles within the White House, which is not unusual, and sometimes can be actually, I think, beneficial. You want different voices arguing and competing, and you have the marketplace of ideas. I think the other problem we had was, remember, when he came into the White House, unlike other presidents, he, obviously was new at this game. Bush, Clinton, et cetera, over the years have built up networks of people that they've worked with as chiefs of staff or functionaries, so they were able to bring in these people. Trump has had people that were either brought in for him. Some have been left over from the Obama administration. Having to clear out that, I think, for instance, Spicer was a good case in point. He just wasn't up for the job. Didn't think the same way the president thought. Scaramucci was fun for 3 days, but didn't quite turn out the way we wanted. But I think you'll see now the ship is steadying. Not so much because Bannon's out, but Kelly's in. And, you have a 4-star Marine general. Ship shape is generally their middle name.
Very acute observations, but I want to tease further this thesis that Bannon said that the White House is now in the hands of the West Wing Democrats. Now, for someone like me, I characterized my attitude to the presidential election thus, that I'm not happy that Donald Trump is the president, but I'm very happy that Hillary Clinton isn't. I
remember the first time you said that to me, I about fell in the middle of the road.
Yes, and I still hold to that point of view, in fact. But if Hillary Clinton is in fact in power, if the West Wing Democrats are actually proponents of her foreign policy, well, I mean, she'll have won even though she lost, although she actually won in popular votes and so on. Do you see the point I'm getting?
I think, I know one of the, just see if I'm on the same track here as you. I know one of the people that's been yelling the loudest over Bannon leaving, of course, is Ann Coulter, the very right-wing commentator. And she feels that we're now starting to get the establishment into the White House. And the whole point of draining the swamp was to fight the establishment. So, you're seeing people like Bannon out, and you're seeing some of these people like, the generals coming in. I mean, I like the generals personally because, again, if you want, as a businessman, he wants things done on time and under budget. And generals are the closest thing to that. Politicians are the furthest thing from that sort of activity. She's been screaming about...
Generals spend a lot of money.
They can do. Yeah, they can do.
Fine. I mean, I just wanted to know if you thought that the changing of the guard in the White House is likely to lead to a more Clinton-esque foreign policy and a less Bannon foreign policy.
Well, I'll tell you, if it was more Clinton-esque, the bombs would have been going off like ages ago.
Charlie, thank you for being so helpful on that. We are discussing the crisis over Korea and the perhaps bigger crisis yet to come in relations between the United States and China, the rivalry that is felt at the top in Washington and in the United States, which has been fueled by the rise of China and the commensurate fall in relative terms of the United States and indeed many other Western countries. I'm George Galloway. This is كلمة حرة for Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. More after this. You're watching كلمة حرة with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen Television in London, but talking Trump and talking the crisis in Korea and the coming crisis, perchance, with China. We took the camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Take a look.
Do you think North Korea has the right to have its own nuclear weapon and missile defences?
No. In the past, with their human rights abuses and stuff, I don't think they should be allowed to have advanced as technologically as they have.
Yeah, of course. If it feels like it's being threatened, if you're playing war games and attempted invasions outside of the country, then why wouldn't they want to feel defended?
What about the US? Should it be allowed to have the nuclear weapons?
I think the US, they're not a perfect nation, but they've done more good in the past than they have bad. So I think that it's important that, as bastions of peace, that they have the right to weapons like that and North Korea don't.
But you do know in the 1950s, North Korea lost 3 million people because of the US and Britain.
I can't say that I know why, I'm afraid.
And when you're looking at does the US have rights to it? Do we have rights to it? Are we seen as threats? Obama, probably not. Trump, you know, if I was North Korea, I'd be sat there going, should he be having nuclear weapons? I don't think he should, so.
Why would anybody want them, you know? But if somebody can have them, why can't everybody have them?
No, I don't think so. Because it's not their leader is not a rational person, so I don't think it's going to be safe for the rest of the world.
So is it safe for the US, considering that it has Trump now? Why should North Korea not have...
I don't think it's safe for us either. I don't think it's safe for the US either, that Trump is actually our president.
Well, there you go. A bastion of freedom, Charlie, at least one person thought. Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to the UN, I think former, still ambassador to the UN. I saw her lips move on television this morning, and she said that the United States was the conscience of the world. I spat my breakfast out, actually, as I saw and heard it. An old comrade of mine, Harpal Brar, what do you think of the debate so far, and what do you think of this whole situation, please?
Thank you, George, for inviting us to this show. It's been very interesting, as indeed almost all your shows are. I'm an avid watcher of your program. I'd just like to start really first with the question of madman theory. There's a madman there. Hitler was a madman, so-and-so was a madman. I personally tend to believe that it's the mad system that produces madmen. It's not madmen who produce mad systems. Hitler wasn't mad. Hitler was a representative of German imperialism, which felt cheated and left out of colonies and avenues of export for the markets. And in the middle of the worst possible crisis up to then of capitalism, they found that there was only one way of settling, and that was war, which caused devastation. 50 million lives were lost. Most of all, 27 million Soviet people lost their lives because the outmoded system wanted to keep its existence. I think it would be a very daring person, George, who would give a certificate of sanity to any of the US presidents, and I include Obama in that. The pivot to Asia is not started by Donald Trump, it's started by his predecessor. Clinton would have done exactly the same, in fact, worse. I would personally rather have this madman in the White House spoiling things for US imperialism than a cool, calculated person like Obama or Hillary Clinton actually coming with a war policy and implementing it. Doesn't make me popular. Probably everybody here hates me for
No, in fact, actually quite a lot of people agree with you, including me.
And thank you, George. And the other thing is, George, it's not new. I mean, I watch program, like for example, I watch RT, and they're constantly saying, why is America making the mistake? They're no more making mistake than you are making a mistake breathing air. I mean, imperialism seeks domination. It doesn't seek liberty, freedom. It may use the language of freedom, rule of law, and international order, but everywhere it's causing disorder because the mad policy is not that there are madmen implementing it. The mad policy is, as you rightly said, they want to dominate the world. They want to be leaders of everybody. There's a slight difference of opinion. The rest of the world does not think they're leaders, and that causes problems. And because America has the power to invade, it's causing devastation in country after country, the latest being Syria now. And the final point, perhaps, if you would allow me, and if I'm not taking too much time, is the contradiction within the system. Donald Trump is a rich man, very rich man. He's a billionaire. But he does not represent the American establishment. And even before he took power, they took up the cudgels against him. They have been doing nothing but delegitimizing him. I'm not a supporter of Trump. A lot of people take it that I support Trump. I don't. The fact of the matter is they do not want him there. As Charlie has said, and that's one point I agree with, he wanted to drain the swamp. But the swamp is far too powerful. They are not going to succeed. And they're taming him in every possible way. His policy is less warlike than that of Obama.
Well, they may be detaining him, judging by his tweet this morning, that he's in Camp David surrounded by very fine generals. He may actually be under detention. Thanks for that. Now, proper decorum has been observed, and so we'll move swiftly to your son, Dr. Ranjit, who wanted to come in first before his father, but I put a stop to all that modern nonsense. Dr. Ranjit.
Thank you very much. So I'm Ranjit Brar. You've said I'm a medical doctor by profession. I'm also a political activist, and there are a couple of points that I think have been very interesting that have been raised. And perhaps we should just start with the key point about the US system and whether or not the US has the right to arrogate to itself the power to be the policeman of the world. It certainly describes itself as such. It has done since the Second World War. It's been the largest imperial power, the largest capitalist power, the leader of the free world, it would call itself. It is an occupation de facto of the world. It has over 1,000 military bases worldwide. And of course, it's never given up any single base that it's occupied since World War II, and why the World War II history is so key to what's going on still. Since it occupied, and we can never forget, actually 4 million were killed in the Korean War.
3 million Koreans, 1 million Chinese?
Fine, 4 million were killed in the Korean conflict, which was generated by the US, albeit fought under UN flag. And of course, the Koreans have never forgotten that. Their country is divided, it's occupied. The larger part might be in a different nation de facto because it was occupied by the US and never given up. Free elections were never held in the South. So this concept that the US has the right because it has votes, you see the extent to which in our conversation about the administration of Trump can't even get its own way, even though he's the president. There's a deeper state. People refer to it as a deep state. Others refer to it just as imperialism, as the ruling class. How is it that they're able to control the overall policy regardless of any election? This is the way in which so-called democracy has been stolen from the common people. By contrast, in Korea, they do have elections. They do have elections. I'm one of the few, perhaps, as well as yourself, George, who's been to Korea. And whatever you say about it, they have good education to all levels. The people are fed and clothed and have a say in the running of their society. The fact that they have a communist party in power is still an anathema, which seems like an anachronism to Charlie and those of his ilk. But that is the choice of their people. So they have a democratic system that is their choice, that provides very well for their people. The reality is that America doesn't want any corner of the world where its writ won't run and where its capital can't penetrate. And with a financial crisis that as deep as it is, it's up in the ante in a very big way. I'll finish because I've spoken too much. I'll say one last point about the relationship between China and Korea. They have a very deep bond. It's a bond that won't be broken regardless of the noises that China has to make sometimes in concession to a great power like the United States. But it's also a two-way bond. It's the Chinese people who also, the Korean people rather, who had played a huge role in the Chinese Revolution, a huge role in liberating China from the Japanese, just as the Chinese then helped the Koreans in liberating themselves from the Japanese. Both sides have fought together against US hegemony, and that goes very deep at the level of the people, at the level of the army, throughout both societies. It's a bond which won't be lightly broken, and both understand very well who is their real enemy, who's the real aggressor in the world, who is it that occupies with 1,000 military bases the entire world, and who is it that's never attacked another country?
Yes,
huge military intervention.
They'd be wise, I
exercises.
think, to postpone these if they want to stabilize this situation. They could easily do so. And some kind of, I did hear that there's been frenetic, I think from Keith, frenetic diplomatic activity going on. I hope that that is one of the issues. I did say on my radio show, and I stand by it, notwithstanding you have warmer relations with the political system in Korea than I do, but I stand by this. If the United States attacks North Korea, every last man, woman, and child in Korea will fight to the last drop of their blood. Everyone needs to know that. The idea that this is Baghdad, that it's going to collapse, even though, of course, Iraq is far from finished. It's not Baghdad. It's not the Iraq war. It's something very different. The Koreans, for whatever reason, will fight to the last drop of the blood of every person in the country if their country is attacked. And that's a very dangerous situation to be entering into. Sir, in the middle row.
I was going to say, my name's Kevin O'Connor. I've been a socialist active all my life. I mean, like you, I mean, I think the real target is, in fact, China. I think North Korea is just a decoy. I think we're in a dialectical freight. I mean, if you look since 1492, I know it's going back a long time, since the Europeans have discovered this so-called, well, invaded this new world, they've used massive brutalised violence against the southern half of the planet. I mean, the United States of America was an infection invasion by Europeans and taken over and did it. So it's the whole, but this dialectical phase is coming to an end. The southern half of the planet, there's equality starting to break out, and this is the rise of China. Is the key factor, which is part of this. So the European and North America, they're frustrated. They're racist mentalities. They like to bully the southern half of the world, you know, the brown skins. I'm not being blunt, but this is coming to an end. So we are, whatever happens, there is going to be a more multipolar world. So I favour negotiation. Personally, I think it is bluster. I don't think there will be a war, but I think in 30 years' time, we will be in a multipolar world. Okay. Common sense will, but
you do feel lucky. I'm going to give the last word to our eminent professor from the LSE, and I'd like you to address, if you would, Professor, this point. The European leaders have not been united in their response to this. The German leader, Merkel, scolded Trump for his language and his irresponsible behavior. Theresa May, our Prime Minister, has not done so. She has continued to hold the hand of President Trump. What do you think the Europeans are really thinking about this crisis?
I think the Europeans are very, very much concerned about the escalation in the rhetoric. They would much rather there were diplomatic avenues used far more forcefully, far more thoroughly. I think that the Germans and the French in particular are horrified that their offer of good officers trying to intervene, be intermediaries in the diplomatic spat between North Korea and the United States has not been taken up. And they are also very, very concerned about their own developing relationship with China. The last thing they need, the last thing any European economy needs, including the British economy, is for a conflict that jeopardizes our increasing dependence on the Chinese economy. I think that the Chinese are very much everywhere right now. They have invested a very great deal in Western economies, as you said, bought up a very great deal of American toxic debt. They've got leverage, they've got manufacturing concerns upon which we are utterly dependent. Even at the luxury end of the market, many Armani clothes, for instance, are now basically tailored in China. So you have an international setup which would be very, very much jeopardized if there was violent conflict. It's not just a case of the world going to nuclear war, even if that's avoided. If the world lurches towards a standoff that jeopardizes international economic relations, it may indeed be the final crisis of capitalism. You can call it all kinds of things of that sort, but it will mean that many people, ordinary people, working people, will suffer very greatly. And I don't think any responsible European leader wants to see that happen. I think there's a great deal of concern in world capitals. I think very, very much in Moscow and in Beijing, there's very, very great concern. And in particular, when you go to Beijing, and I go to Beijing reasonably often, and you ask them what's going to happen, they say, we actually don't know. All we know, and I think this is where the Americans are frightened, all we know is that it's our turn now. The global tables are being turned. It's the turn of the oppressed South to be dominant in the world. It may or may not lead to a better system, but it will lead to a major global historical change.
Well, I think that's a good note to end what I personally think has been an outstanding edition of كلمة حرة. With me, George Galloway, for الميادين television.